As you know, tomorrow we will mark the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a day the federal government has set aside to acknowledge the history of the residential schools and to honor the children taken, their families and their communities. And it's a real opportunity for us to commit to learning more about the history of the experiences of Indigenous peoples across Canada and the direct role that all of us continue to play in the shared truth of that history. I also want us to remember that Western University is located on the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. Those treaties were made between the Crown and members of the Indigenous communities in this area. And as a beneficiary of those treaties, I recognize my responsibilities under those treaties. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to our society. We respect the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land as they're the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that all Indigenous peoples endure in Canada. And as a community, we need to accept our own responsibility as members of a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service. Now, this afternoon, it's a sincere pleasure to introduce Professor Matt James from the Department of Political Science at the University of Victoria. Dr. James has published on reparation and memory and political apology in journals like Human Rights Review and the International Journal of Transitional Justice. He also produced a major report on truth commissions, victims, and perpetrators around the world for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And he's a busy guy. He's currently working on a couple of different intersecting projects, the first of which focuses on how to work critically with Truth Commission reports, apologies, and so on to address their insufficiencies and pathologies in ways that promote social accountability. And the second focuses on community responses to acts of hate and political critique of contemporary mainstream anti-hate discourses. Obviously, those two things are closely related, and that's the subject of his talk this afternoon, How the History Wars Came to Canada, the TRC, and the Unanticipated Politics of Toppling Statues. So Matt, once again, we are really happy to be able to get you back to Western, even if it's only by Zoom this time. And I hope that all of you will join me now in welcoming Professor James. Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Joe. That was an exceedingly generous introduction. I appreciate it very much. I also thanks for those of you who are there for being here, and I'm happy to be speaking to many people who are on Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape and Attawandaron territory. I'm coming to you from traditional Lekwungen territory, and specifically Wisanich Nations territory, also known as Saanich, BC, on Vancouver Island here. I want to acknowledge tomorrow's National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. It's a product of Indigenous resistances and resurgences that pushed the country to this point, especially the Indian residential school survivors and day school survivors who fought for the TRC, who funded the TRC out of the class action settlement that they reached with the government and the churches responsible for the residential schools, and insisting that the settlement provide for the TRC. The survivors did that, and then call to action number 80 of the TRC was to mark September 30 as a National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. So tomorrow's their day. My take here, or approach in this talk, is to kind of focus inward on Canadian commemorative responses to what Paulette Reagan and others have so aptly called the settler problem. And so that's this kind of specific focus that I'm bringing here. Those of you who are out there, it's great to see faces. So anybody who feels like having their camera on, that's great. I appreciate it. It helps me to kind of figure out what's going wrong. But obviously, people who don't want their cameras on, I completely respect that too, and don't want to be invading privacy here. I especially want to thank Joanna for inviting me, her generosity as a scholar. I think maybe most importantly for using a 10-year-old picture of me on the event publicity poster. But more seriously, I just want to acknowledge Jo's leadership in the Canadian political science community and for bringing her deep background as a comparativist with serious knowledge of transitional justice cases in the global south and bringing that knowledge to bear on questions of Indigenous settler reconciliation in Canada. Kate Corricky, I also want to acknowledge for her leadership in helping to forge a Canadian memory studies community. Corey Kielbisky, I want to acknowledge stellar grad student I'm working with who's influenced my thinking on today's topic. And I also, and I'm just going to put this in the chat, Omiyasu Wapasu, who's a Nehiya scholar of Canadian commemoration, has also been important in this regard. And I'm just going to plop into the chat a link to a roundtable that Omiyasu participated in, so that people, get bored with this one and want to go watch something else. You can see what Omiyasu Wapasu has to say about commemoration there. So I guess I'll just get going. I'll do something else here. I'm also going to put in the chat a link to a Dropbox file, which contains an outline of this talk. So if anybody wants to kind of see the outline, figure out what the different sections of the talk are, follow along as we go, that's there for you also. So this talk, like a lot, it started with a title, How the History Wars Came to Canada, the TRC, and the Unanticipated Politics of Toppling Statues. I thought it sounded kind of arresting and exciting and would, make people want to come. And developing the talk from the title has really been this process of backtracking and qualifying to the point that I now realize I'm quite guilty of a fair bit of false advertising. So why don't I just start by kind of clarifying a few things. The title refers to history wars, and that term has wide resonance because of the German, Australian, American cases, but I'm actually focusing on commemoration. So history, right, it's the more scholarly process of researching and interpreting the past, and commemoration is about normatively marking the past in public spaces and mnemonic, that means memory making or memory prompting, mnemonic practices. So I'm looking at commemoration, not history. Then the title says how the history wars came to Canada, and that might imply some kind of deep process tracing that persuasively identifies the most important causal factors that have brought commemorative battles to Canada. And I'm not doing that either. I'm actually I'll say a few things about different factors, but I'm really focusing on what I think is an important factor and a really surprising factor, and that's the TRC. Because the TRC didn't call for removing statues, didn't call for renaming buildings. It avoided singling out individuals for historical or contemporary for any kind of blame at all. And yet it's been crucial in getting Canadian institutions and authorities to start making commemorative decisions that are about blaming, that are about censure, that are about stigma. And that paradox, I think, reflects a really important lesson about truth and reconciliation commissions, about historical justice processes, transitional justice processes more generally. And it's that authorities often pursue these processes with aims of closure and depoliticization in mind. They want to, as one critic put it, they want to silence the writhing pain and trauma of the past. They want to close the books on it. They want to move on. And these processes are certainly often designed with that in mind, and they often fail. And they wind up leading to results that the authorities didn't want, and the critics of transitional justice and historical justice processes often don't believe that historical and transitional justice can bring about. So that's a kind of the key point where the talk's going to wind up, but I wanted to basically observe the key point here for now is just I'm not doing deep process tracing on exactly why all these battles are now. Last bit of false advertising in the title, it refers provocatively to toppling statues. So my cases are the statue of Sir Johnny MacDonald, formerly resident in front of Victoria City Hall, statue of Sir Edward Cornwallis, formerly resident in the former Cornwallis Park in Halifax, a statue of Egerton Ryerson in front of the place now known as University X that's about to undergo a renaming process of its own. So I'll just share the screen for a little bit here. And only one of these cases involves a toppling, and I'm hoping that you're seeing there, that's poor Egerton Ryerson lying on his side there. Ryerson was a 19th century public education advocate. He was a noted public servant of his day. He was, and I don't even mean it pejoratively necessarily, he was an ideologist of settler colonialism. And he was certainly one of the first proponents of mandatory Christianizing of Indigenous peoples in residential schools. So the statue there was decapitated on the 5th of June, 2021. It eventually got decapitated as well and taken to the land defense encampment at 1492 Landback Lane. And the University Task Force now has recommended, as of summer 2021, has recommended that Ryerson find himself a new name. So here, not being toppled, being hoisted, is Sir Edward Cornwallis. It's actually not Cornwallis. The sculptor was mixed up, or he didn't have a likeness of Cornwallis, but it's actually somebody else, but it's supposed to be of Cornwallis. And Cornwallis was a key military figure in the founding of Halifax. He's a naval commander, and he's notorious for having placed a bounty on Mi'kmaq scalps because he was attempting genocidally to ethnically cleanse the area for white settlement. And Cornwallis was removed by a decision of council on the 1st of February 2018. And the park renamed Peace and Friendship Park. That's referring to the 18th century peace and friendship treaties with Mi'kmaq and other East Coast nations. And that renaming was recommended in summer of 2020. And lastly, we've got Sir John A. Macdonald here, and he really looks like he's being hanged, not toppled. And you know, he's Canada's first prime minister. He's obviously instrumental in advocating the elimination of indigeneity via mandatory residential schooling, and the family separation, the assimilation, the child removal, and all that followed from that. As a political scientist, I also like to observe his role in Confederation, where he was instrumental in organizing the constitutional powers of the governments in Canada to make Indigenous nations and individuals colonial subjects. And that was a very, very strong repudiation of earlier directives from the United Kingdom to make treaties and to recognize Indigenous nations as nations. So that's a kind of pivotal thing there. And Sir John A. Macdonald was removed by an order of Victoria City Council on 11th of August, 2018. Okay, so it's all downhill from here. There's no more visuals, just me talking. So here we go. I'm going to give you some context now, because I am stressing the important role of the TRC in bringing commemorative battles to Canada, but other factors are important. I'll try to kind of name a few of them. And if I'm going quickly, it's because I know that this talk is way too long and I want to get to the conceptual kind of part rather than running out of time on description. So I'm going to try to keep on going pretty briskly here. So Indigenous activism and resurgence. I'm saying the TRC is an important factor. Well, the TRC is inconceivable without Indigenous resurgence and residential school survivors and their resilience in their battles. But just from the Cornwallis case, give you a couple examples. In 1993, the Mi'kmaq elder Daniel Paul, he wrote a book called We Were Not the Savages that really highlighted Cornwallis and his ethnic cleansing policies and the bounty on Mi'kmaq scalps. When Halifax Council voted against, not just against removing the statue or against renaming the park, but against even convening a task force to even investigate the question in 2016, a Mi'kmaq poet, Rebecca Thomas, who was also Halifax's poet laureate at that time, shamed council with a blistering poem called Not Perfect. The defenders of Cornwallis were saying, oh, sure, you know, he wasn't perfect. And I'm going to put the link to Not Perfect in the chat as well, in case anybody wants to check out a reading of Rebecca Thomas doing that poem. More Indigenous activism and resurgence in the Cornwallis case. On July 2017, a group of primarily Mi'kmaq advocates, but also settler allies, working on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls issues, conducted a mourning ceremony at the statue of Cornwallis on Canada Day. And that ceremony triggered, and I use the word triggered advisedly, triggered a very fragile group of people known as Proud Boys, who waged a white supremacist counter-protest. And that counter-protest of the Proud Boys, it really exposed links between the Canadian military, because they were all except one were members of the armed forces, admiration of Cornwallis, key military figure, white supremacy, and Indigenous genocide. And all of that certainly made it harder for Halifax to defend the Cornwallis statue in the name of the park. And I list all those things as just illustrative of the kind of Indigenous activism and resurgence factors that are going to be present in all cases of this sort. Another key backdrop for the cases is what people in the American context have called whitelash. It's what David Renton calls the new authoritarianism, wave of far-right populism sweeping many countries around the world, very much associated, of course, with Trump and Trumpism. And in the world of commemoration, it's really symbolized by the notoriously neo-fascist Unite the Right March in Charlottesville, Virginia, August 2017, which was all about, right, defending statues of noted white supremacists. The Black Lives Matter fight against global symbols of white supremacy raised the cost of defending these statues. Specifically, African-Canadian activism in both the Halifax and the Ryerson cases. The Black Liberation Collective at Ryerson was extremely important. In Halifax, the leadership of the noted African-Canadian church, which was at that point called the Cornwallis Street Baptist Church, they renamed their church the New Horizons Baptist Church, and that placed more pressure to rename Cornwallis Park. And the other thing I want to note is the revelations about mass graves at the sites of Indian residential schools, especially important in the Ryerson case. The 28th of May, in the summer of 2020, there was about 215 mass graves announced. The discovery was announced by the Tk'emlúps Tshekwaphem First Nation. And that led directly to a protest at Ryerson on the 6th of June that toppled Ryerson. So that photo of Ryerson toppled goes back directly to that protest triggered by the discovery at the Tk'emlúps Tshekwaphem. So what the scholar Manuel Castells calls networks of outrage and hope. I think overall context here is that decolonial and anti-racist networks of outrage and hope fighting against white supremacy, neo-fascism, Trumpism have brought about a kind of critical juncture in which these decisions about renaming and removing statues is happening. So what about the TRC? In each case we're talking about here, authorities in municipalities and at Ryerson wanted to respond to the 2015 final report of the TRC, wanted to respond to the 94 calls of action, and they all issued institutional pledges. Halifax had a statement of reconciliation. Victoria had a truth and reconciliation calls to action task force. Ryerson had a truth and reconciliation at Ryerson report. And each of those initial responses to the TRC functioned as what I want to call here an earnest. And it's kind of an archaic term. You're used to hearing it as an adjective, but as a noun, an earnest means, and I'm quoting here from some dictionary somewhere, a sum of money paid in advance as a deposit. Hence, a pledge, a guarantee, an indication of something to come. So those formal pledges in response to the TRC to implement the calls, work on reconciliation, basically invited accusations of hypocrisy, licensed accusations of hypocrisy a few years down the road when activism is building, and yet these statues are still hanging around, these places are still being named after colonizers and genocidaires. In then response to those accusations of hypocrisy, activists, basically attempting to cash in the earnests, the authorities then responded with more task forces and deliberative bodies that wound up recommending removing the statues or renaming. And I'll come back to the details on these task forces and deliberative bodies a little bit later. But one point that I will be returning to is that in striking these specific deliberative bodies to look into removing statues, renaming parks, the authorities were guided by the TRC in some very interesting ways also that led to innovative processes, that led to innovative results. But to basically summarize what I'm saying about the TRC so far, the TRC made authorities who were looking to respond to networks of outrage and hope at a moment of potential decolonization and change. The authorities wanted to be seen to be doing something. They made pledges. Those pledges then got used against them when they backslid and failed to act. They were forced to follow up, and in following up, they wound up heeding the TRC in really interesting ways. What's counterintuitive about all this is that the TRC did not recommend removing or renaming anything. The first writings from the TRC that were made available to the Canadian public in 2015 in the final summary report, in the preface of the final summary report, the TRC commissioners began by telling everybody, and I quote, "Shaming and pointing out wrongdoing were not the purpose of the TRC's mandate. We're not about shaming. We're not about pointing out wrongdoing." And I hope you realize that removing statues and renaming parks when they're named after figures of white supremacy and genocide is very much about shaming and pointing out wrongdoing. So there's a paradox this way. And the TRC was designed basically so that this kind of result wouldn't happen. The churches and government parties in the negotiations that created the TRC, they refused to give the TRC subpoena powers. They denied the TRC the power to make individual findings of fault or blame. It was not to serve as a public inquiry. It was designed as a no-fault space for survivor healing and voice. And I do not mean to say that that's not important. It's absolutely crucial and probably the first order of business. But it's just to observe, in the language of transitional justice, the TRC was a victim-centered or survivor-centered body that was relatively indifferent to finer-grained questions of responsibility, punishment, and blame. And it's not an idiosyncrasy of the TRC. In fact, your Western colleague, Pauline Wakeham, has been incredibly influential in helping me to see the kind of patternings I'm associating with the TRC as much deeper reflections of something that Pauline Wakeham in her co-authored work and in her own work, but co-authored stuff with Jennifer Henderson as well, is called Canadian redress culture. A kind of recurrent patterning that when times are tough or the rubber hits the road, responds to demands for historical justice and transitional justice, certainly with expressions of care and sympathy for victims. We're so sorry for what happened to you, but doesn't do explorations of perpetrator blame and responsibility. And I think that this patterning is starting to break down a little bit, at least with respect to commemoration. And the interesting irony I'm seeing here is that the TRC is, I think, a central reason. David McDonald, political scientist colleague, he says the TRC was actually quite savvy in this respect, that it was very careful to observe the limits of what Pauline Wakeham and others call Canadian redress culture. It engineered the beginnings of an Indian residential school reckoning, but without provoking the kind of backlash that could have doomed the whole enterprise. But there's a backlash now, right? Once cherished Canadian heroes are being shunned as perpetrators. The political right, both the mainstream institutional incarnation and the kind of frenzied online stormtroopers of the would-be white ethno-state, are fighting back. There are numerous petitions to defend Egerton Ryerson, defend Sir John A. Macdonald and his legacy. There's petitions, there's open letters, political entrepreneurs on the right attempt to kind of compile donor lists and fundraise off of this, you know, click here if you want to defend Sir John A. Macdonald and so on. And, you know, the Proud Boys showed up to defend Cornwallis. The Soldiers of Odin were on hand to protest the removal of Sir John A. Macdonald in Victoria. So the kind of puzzle here is, how could a no-fault TRC that basically invisibilized perpetrators and didn't deal with questions of blame and shame, how could it have sparked these kinds of commemorative battles that are all about honoring and blaming and shunning? So it's partly a story of what the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu would call the state and state bodies and their symbolic power of nomination. It's the power of nomination, as in the symbolic power of officialdom to name, to declare certain realities reality, to elevate certain propositions and claims through, you know, official, even if they're arm's length, but nevertheless, you know, official institutional bodies like the TRC. So in the context, right, of the beginnings of some kind of decolonial reckoning, with activist pressure mounting, networks of outrage and hope, organizations like municipalities and universities were looking for some kind of guidance, and the TRC report and the calls to action gave them something nominated, something authorized, something that seemed kind of beyond the realm of partisan politics to heed. And it's also, as I've said, it's partly a story about earnests, about making pledges to respond to the TRC that then became kind of payable when the networks of outrage and hope in 2017 and through 2020 really put the statues of colonizers in the spotlight. And there's a deeper story here about the deeper message of the TRC. And maybe in hindsight, this is the essential core. And the message is a message of partnership and collaboration. And you can consider the calls to action that are relevant to issues of commemoration in the TRC report are calls to action 79 through 83. I'm just putting them in the chat here too, if anybody wants to follow those up. None of the calls to action explicitly dealing with commemoration in the TRC report are addressed to municipalities. None of them call for removing or renaming anything. They're about things like a reconciliation framework for Canadian heritage and commemoration, calls for an Indian residential schools monument in Ottawa, calls for similar monuments to be established in provincial capitals. But each one of these calls about commemoration begins with some kind of formulation like in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, or in collaboration with survivors and their organizations. And this, I think, has turned out to be pretty crucial in terms of the task forces and deliberative bodies that the authorities wound up getting kind of pushed into establishing here. When they're, you know, being forced to start paying the immediate post-TRC earnests that they'd made in the form of those institutional pledges, they established new and in some cases quite innovative collaborative bodies to guide their decisions about what to do about renaming and removing. So Victoria created a witness reconciliation program and turned also to a body called the Victoria City Family. And that's a mix of Indigenous and settler representatives. And on top of that, specific individuals nominated by the Esquimalt and the Songhees First Nations to represent those First Nations. So it's almost a kind of a quasi-diplomatic environment in collaboration. Halifax's task force on the commemoration of Edward Cornwallis and the commemoration of Indigenous history, after some kind of false starts when it was a fairly traditional body, it got completely remade into a body that was funded equally and that had equal representation from Halifax City Council and the Nova Scotia Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs. Ryerson's Mashko Weeka Powin Standing Strong Task Force is considerably weaker than the other bodies. And maybe that weakness of response at Ryerson had something to do with why the statue got toppled rather than, actually Ryerson getting up in front of it and removing it. But even there, right, 4 of the 14 members of the task force were Indigenous, and it was co-chaired equally by a settler and an Indigenous scholar. Now here's, and I'm working towards a conclusion here. Now here's the TRC, volume 6 from the final report. And that's the volume that's simply titled Reconciliation. And in the section dealing specifically with reconciliation, the TR says, and I quote, "We believe that true reconciliation can take place only through a reshaping of a shared national collective memory, a reshaping of a shared collective national memory of who we are and what has come before." So the cases I've examined here are preliminary examples of a shared collaborative reshaping. And turning specifically to the topic of commemorative battles or history wars, in each one of these cases, and I've done pretty exhaustive media searches of public reaction to the decisions to remove or rename in the Ryerson, the Cornwallis, and the MacDonald and Victoria cases. In each one of these cases, that I have not been able to find a single opponent of removing the statue or renaming a park, not been able to find a single defender of Sir John A. Macdonald or Egerton Ryerson or Edward Cornwallis, not been able to find a single defender who has even attempted to explain or address how keeping statues or keeping these names could somehow be squared with any kind of collaborative approach to national memory in this country. Nobody. I mean, the letters to the editor, the online forums, that they're just chock full of people defending Egerton Ryerson and Sir John A. Macdonald, but none of these folks even attempts to address the question of, well, should we be making joint decisions about national memory? Are Indigenous views maybe perhaps important to consider when thinking about commemorative landscapes? None of them even touch any of this stuff. They all presume, no matter how polite or well-intentioned, they all presume with this idea that the majority and its institutions gets to decide that settlers have the final say. And so in conclusion, what I would want to say is, I think one lesson of these cases and of the TRC generally is that this kind of majoritarianism in commemoration is just completely untenable. You might as well simply call it what it is, right? We don't care what Indigenous peoples have to say. We will continue to rub in their faces statues of colonizers and genocide heirs. Collaborating on shared memory is going to change the commemorative landscape. It's going to involve dethroning, it's going to involve stigmatizing, it's going to involve blaming former heroes. The no-fault redress culture of Canada will change. So a second group of conclusions here is simply to reiterate that historical justice processes and transitional justice processes, they're unpredictable. Authorities definitely turn to them for closure. They stage manage them for closure. They want to silence the writhing pain of the past. They want to close dark chapters. They want all those tropes. And Canada certainly attempted to use the TRC this way. I remember being at probably the first conference on the TRC before they, when the original group of commissioners were still in place and the commission hadn't done anything, hadn't had any events or anything yet. And the then head of the International Center for Transitional Justice, he called the TRC mandate in Canada toothless. He said he'd never seen one as weak as this practically. And yet, here we are. these processes create incentives for action. They can prompt authorities to issue earnests. They give activists resources of accountability. And in accountability, I'm guided by my colleague Rosemary Nagy here, who I wanted to acknowledge as well, who's done a lot of really important work on the TRC and social accountability. But so even if they're intended to bring about closure and to manage the politics of it all and put us all behind us, TRCs and instances of historical and transitional justice can create these dynamics that fuel processes of social accountability. And they can certainly, and I'm thinking this ethic of collaboration in commemoration to create a shared national memory is an emergent understanding that is beginning to come out of the TRC. And I think that we're only now just beginning to glimpse where it might lead. So that's the end. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matt. As usual, you've given us a lot to think about. And the great thing is that we have time for questions. You have laid out for us a very interesting set of ideas, and I know our participants will likely have questions and thoughts. So let me turn now to the participants.